you think it's a good idea to pull this museum to bits? No! If you think it's a terrible idea, put your hand up and make a noise.
The Powerhouse Museum, just outside the Sydney CBD, once rivaled the great technical museums of the world. Half historic halls bringing life to old technology, the other half a science and design wonderland with quirky spaces and a machine-like interior. Many a Sydney-sider has fond memories of wandering along Locomotive One's platform, watching the steam engines spin or listening to the Planet Clock show. But after 10 years of government mismanagement, the museum we knew has come to an end. A so-called heritage restoration is about to begin, but it would be more accurately described as heritage desecration. And yet most media outlets act as if this story already had a happy ending. The politicians boast about how much they are spending. Spinning this waste is a big investment in Sydney's culture. We've been fighting this plan since the very beginning, so stick around and we'll give you a close-up view on what happened. This so-called restoration of the Powerhouse Museum will see the display area of the museum downsized, the colonnade along Harris Street turned into a set of studios for hire. The interior will be completely gutted, removing all trace of the award-winning museum they claim to preserve. The restored engine room, which housed the famous live steam display, to be demolished. All the little galleries, which once housed displays on science, technology and design, all being stripped away in favour of large volume spaces designed with events, parties and temporary exhibits in mind. All this is in spite of objections from the National Trust, International Council of Museums, local groups, and many of the people who were involved in founding the museum in the first place. In short, this plan is a disaster, reducing the museum to a generic display space. It's like the museum equivalent of one of those soulless Disney remakes, with little understanding of what made the original good in the first place. It's like one of those sad renovations before and afters you sometimes see on social media, where all the interesting parts have been stripped out. Or like how fast food places went from having their own character to generic building design focused more on resale value. So how did we get to this sorry situation? Well, let's go right back to the start. The plan to build the Powerhouse Museum began in the late 70s when its predecessor, the Technological Museum, was running out of space. At the time, the former Ultimo power plant had stood derelict for many years following the removal of the tram network it once powered. Along with the power plant stood an old tram depot, which would later become the Howard Building. Lindsay Sharp, who would later become the Powerhouse Museum founding director, brought then curator Norman Harwood a proposal for an innovative new museum based on what he'd learnt from studying museums worldwide. This museum would move away from the traditional Cabinet of Curiosities approach to museums and be interpretive, interactive, and at the cutting edge of a new movement in science museums. It would also have a strong sense of local identity and make use of the power and transport heritage of the site in its themes. This proposal impressed the then Premier Neville Wran, and the Powerhouse Museum began. The old power plant would get a new roof, and parts of the interior would be restored or reinterpreted, such as the engine room, which was to host the steam engines, and new floors in the turbine hall, which would echo the original decks of the power plant. All this is being stripped away under the current plan. Added on to this would be a new postmodernist building which lead architect Lionel Glendenning designed to reference Sydney's Garden Palace, a predecessor of the museum with its own fascinating history. These references will be gone after the renovation, with the glass facade truncated and the Galleria bricked up. This upper section would serve as the main entrance to the museum. On Harris Street, you'd enter the museum under a long colonnade. Passers-by on the street would get a glimpse of what they could see inside thanks to the use of glass in the facades. The interior layout Richard Johnson created was a fun postmodernist adventure, using bold colours and geometric forms, as well as murals, to give the place a sense of adventure. The idea was that key items, such as Locomotive One or the Catalina, would serve as landmarks to orient visitors. Glimpses of these would be seen throughout the museum. The whole round building is also set to be demolished. The steel structure was never intended to support the brick walls they want to add. This museum was to be a treasure trove, full of things to discover as you moved around its many spaces. The balconies and ramps made sure getting around the museum would be an experience in itself. As you moved through the space, new perspectives on objects would become available. The proposed design removes this entirely, opting for a simple elevator bay and a stairwell connected to 4 large halls, one of which may spend most of its time as an auditorium, rather than as museum space. As well as the forever evolving permanent displays, the original Powerhouse Museum was designed with a number of spaces suitable for temporary exhibitions, and 2 theatrettes to host talks and conferences. Thanks to an environmental control system which made use of the original cooling systems of the power plant, conditions in parts of the museum were good enough that they were permitted to host the Codex Leicester in the year 2000, something not all museums can boast. Of the permanent exhibits, many of the items had a distinctive Sydney flavour and would teach local history, as well as how design and tech shaped people's lives from the past to the present. Many of these were interactive, tactile even, requiring physical engagement from the visitor experiencing them, something often missing in the age of the touchscreen. Altogether, it was a powerful visit for STEAM education, long before that acronym became a thing. It continued this way for many years, inspiring generations of Aussie children with its creative exhibits. A controversial restructure and renovation in 2013 is seen as the beginning of the end by some former museum staff. This was when the Rand Building Hall was separated out from the rest of the museum and the glass facades blacked out. But the museum continued to do what it had been doing all along, bringing to life the technology of the past, bringing together science and design, and showing the art in everyday things. So what went wrong? In 2014, the New South Wales Liberal state government was in the middle of a fire sale. Land set aside to potentially expand infrastructure, or anything else they could get away with selling off, was being sold off. And there, sitting right by a busy business and entertainment district, was a huge patch of land, occupied by a museum that the government was paying to run. Plans were already being drawn up to turn the nearby Darling Harbour into an even larger entertainment precinct than it already was. If sold to a developer, or perhaps the university next door, maybe it could net them a pretty penny. In November 2014, they announced the plan. The powerhouse would be sold off, and the museum moved to a new site in Parramatta. The flaws in this plan were obvious from the start. Parramatta sits on a floodplain, posing considerable risk to the delicate objects that the museum houses. The cost and risk reductions of the current on-site storage at Ultimo would not apply here. Items would need to be trucked in from the secondary storage at Castle Hill. The proposed site was significantly smaller, plus it had little of the historic connection to transport or energy generation, key themes of the original museum which would be lost. The expected revenue from selling the Ultimo site wouldn't even be enough to fund such a project, and the government was being very cagey, not releasing the business case. The plans were so clearly flawed, it had many news outlets and prominent figures in outcry.
Please, don't let them sell the Powerhouse Museum.
By 2015, protests began in earnest, often occupying the public courtyard outside the museum. A parliamentary inquiry began in 2016, which would eventually recommend that the move be halted, and yet the plan to close the powerhouse persisted. Eventually, the government floated the idea of preserving some of it as a cultural facility, or a lyric theatre, or a fashion museum. Fashion, as an example of applied arts, that is, arts with a purpose, has long been an important, if less popular part of the Powerhouse collection, but it doesn't make sense for this to be at Ultimo. It doesn't link to the power and transport heritage values of the site like most of the iconic parts of the original museum did. This would be fine for a new museum at Parramatta, but a waste of the site at Ultimo. This pivot to fashion seemed more like an effort to attract a more high-paying elite crowd, rather than the family and general public audience they went for before. A STEAM volunteer once told me at an event in Thirlmere,
"They're not making it for people like you and me. Those people wouldn't be caught dead in the things that we're wearing."
Which, for the record, was a fairly ordinary jumper and t-shirt. By 2018, they had appointed Lisa Havila as CEO, not director, CEO of the museum. Formerly the CEO of Carriageworks, which was making a loss by the end of her tenure, and later had to be bailed out financially by the government. In a speech Havila made in 2021 in Adelaide, titled Unmaking the Institution, she said,
"I didn't ask the audience what they want. I ignored the data."
And that her strategy for dealing with concerns over her plans was
Not responding until it no longer matters, and that's a very special bureaucratic strategy.
She talked about
Milking every asset.
essentially that her approach would be to reorient the facility for making as much money as possible. The recording of this speech has since been made private. Years later, a different STEAM volunteer, while demonstrating the steam organ, told me privately
The CEO hates this thing.
and made it very clear that she wasn't interested in historic technology. At this time, volunteers who spoke out more publicly about the museum's direction change were quietly being asked to leave. Curators and other experienced staff were being sacked too, and the Powerhouse was slowly shedding expertise, without view to replace them. In these last few years, the Powerhouse's exhibits moved away from science and technology and started to lean more into commissioning artworks inspired by the collections. Atmospheric Memory did away with the idea of being educational altogether, being a light show based on 19th century pseudoscience. Even 1001 Remarkable Objects, considered by many as a final hurrah for the museum, lacked much of an expository goal. Parties and music events at the museum were on the increase, and damage to the items was the result. Along with this change in offerings, the word museum was dropped from the marketing materials. Powerhouse could mean anything they wanted it to mean. Even now, one of the major exhibits planned for the Parramatta Powerhouse is just a big music and light show. Public outcry over the planned closure continued even into the COVID years. The museum, which had closed down due to the pandemic and looked to stay closed, suddenly got a reprieve. In 2022, the government announced plans to keep the museum in Ultimo and open a second site. This was met with celebration from the protesters, but also with caution. Details were yet to come. What was the government planning? With Ultimo seemingly saved, things were looking up for the Powerhouse. The government announced plans to renovate it, a chance to repair and upgrade, fix the wayfinding issues that mismanagement and clumsy alteration had wrought, replace much of the aging interactives, and repair damage to the roof and guttering. The process started off seemingly well. In March 2022, they started with discussion sessions as part of a special open weekend. I attended these personally. People at these sessions criticized plans to emphasize fashion over technology and previous alterations to the museum's layout, as well as the current lack of navigational aid. They also praised the museum's grandeur and quirkiness, its iconic spaces, and the memorable displays of design and technology. There was a general sense that the place needed a refit, but a desire to keep it in the same spirit. The government had made a promise to work with the protest groups, including the museum experts and former directors and curators, whose long-stated goal was to see the museum return to its former glory. But this went south fast. Meetings were held, but communications soon broke down. Remember earlier, talked about Powerhouse CEO Havila's method of dealing with complaints? The Powerhouse's Conservation Management Plan, which is a document which outlines how a historic building is to be preserved and protected, was being drawn up by Alan Croker, Director of Design 5. Design 5 was also doing the heritage plan for the White Bay Power Plant, now a celebrated, award-winning restoration. But shortly into the process, Alan and Design 5 were let go. Alan maintains that this was because his findings, that much of the museum's essential character should be preserved, conflicted with the goals of those behind the project. For these last years, Powerhouse management would continue to slowly remove and even give away some of the displays to other museums. Half of the famous transport hall was emptied out and then used to host a fashion show. Ecologic, the climate and sustainability display, was removed and replaced with Climate Conversations, a series of videos all playing on top of each other, impossible to learn anything useful from. Very little about the direction had changed. This was the Cultural Facility Plan, just with a much higher budget. New South Wales Labor, in opposition at the time, acted like they were well aware of all these problems. They even stated particular concern over all the focus on event rather than museum spaces in the plan, claiming it reflected the previous government's obsession with commercialization. After they won the 2023 election, they announced they'd be pivoting from the last government's plan and instead doing a heritage restoration. In the state of New South Wales, museums come under the Arts Ministry. As Shadow Minister, John Graham had plenty to say about saving the museum, even if he admitted he didn't know too much at the start. However, after the election, this was not the case. As a government minister, Graham also held a number of other portfolios. Note that there's not science nor education, but nighttime economy, a clear conflict of interest for those wanting to keep the museum as a museum, rather than letting it be refocused as an event centre. But even if that wasn't the case, as a minister for such high priority portfolios such as roads, jobs, tourism, how could he ever find the time to give the museum the consideration it needed? Of course, a minister doesn't run a department on their own. But the problem was, all these departments were still staffed by people appointed by the last government, who wanted to convert or sell off the museum. You'd hope a government coming in on a promise to change up what was happening would actually change things, wouldn't you? Instead, they kept on the same people. They even extended the terms of the current museum board instead of finding replacements. As the planning process went on, they continued to run public consultations, but the feedback wasn't listened to. When the Powerhouse Museum closed down in 2024, volunteers and staff, the people who knew the most about actually running the place, it's not unusual for a museum to be renovated in stages. The Australian Museum, not far from here, did exactly that. Even the original Powerhouse Museum did that, publishing draft plans for exhibits as promotional material years before it actually opened. It's also not unusual for objects to remain in place during a renovation, being protected in situ. The Smithsonian, also currently under renovation, is doing that at the moment. So why the rush? Why the push to remove everything? Because the more of the museum they packed up, the easier it was to tell the public it's too late to stop now, once the full plans were revealed. Plus, out of sight, out of mind, and far easier to avoid controversy. At this point, Powerhouse began using influencers to try and gain favourable publicity. But they never talked in any detail about what they were going to do. Videos instead were focusing on favourite items, not understanding that the likes of these would not return, such as this short about the organ in the Powerhouse's restored 1930s cinema. This won't be in the rebuilt Powerhouse, and if its built elements survive, they sure won't be brought to life as they once were. In addition, they began circulating images of the relatively minor damage that the renovation was allegedly fixing. These images included images of a crack in the chimney, but this was a firing crack, left when the furnace was first fired up over 100 years ago. It was stable and preserved as it was deliberately, something they should have known if they'd done their research. Following this pattern, they'd continue to emphasize minor or easily fixable issues as excuses to tear the whole place down rather than repair it properly. Images of the new plan shared on social media focused on the external, emphasizing the plans for new outdoor areas, and de-emphasized the plans they planned to remove large parts of the building. Improvements to public space was something that could have been achieved easily separately to any building changes. Even the removal of the original facades would not have been necessary to achieve this plan. There were few details disclosed in these social media posts, but hey, all those likes and comments from people who glimpsed the plan and thought about it for 2 seconds would look great on the planning reports. Never mind that of the formal submissions to planning, 90% were objecting, and these were from people who had taken time to sit down and write about the plans. This so-called heritage restoration involves stripping out all the internals of the building. The current version practically tears down the whole thing. The Bolton & Watt steam engine was the only working one of its type. Expert advice at the time was once installed, it should never be moved again. Over 200 years old, the metal is now fragile, and mishandling could easily cause cracks or other damage that would prevent it from ever running again. Promises had been given that it would stay in place, yet according to planning documents, it would end up relegated to the end of the corridor, a horrible space for viewing it. In retrospect, it's easy to see that they never planned to keep it there.
Similarly, the classroom area was going to be replaced with a new loading dock facility, despite there already being one which could be updated in the Harwood building. Named for curator Norman Harwood, the Harwood building was the museum's extensive on-site storage facility. Ones of its size are rare among inner-city museums, but this plan to split Harwood off from the rest of the complex hinted at plans to remove or sell off the Harwood building. The first plan approved was about to do exactly that, but was later rolled back. But the monkey paw curls, and when Harwood was saved, the updated plan now included complete demolition of the Rand building, the original public face of the museum. Win a metre, lose a mile. This wing of the museum, which still has much of its postmodernist design elements still intact, is planned to be completely demolished and replaced with a new building, lined in brick as if pretending to be part of the original power station, the exact opposite of the architect's original intent.
In mid-2024, It looked like a move to heritage list the whole Powerhouse Museum might force a rethink of the whole plan. Unfortunately, as you might have guessed, once again this was not as it seems. Technically, the Powerhouse already had a state heritage listing, but this listing only protected the remains of the plant itself, not the museum or any of the restoration work that had been done to bring back lost parts of the power plant. Protecting so little, this listing had deliberately been made very convenient for a government wanting to sell the site off. Documents supporting this new heritage listing had much to say about how the Powerhouse Museum was an important moment in the history of the Australian built heritage movement, as well as a great example of heritage conservation. Also covered was its significance in the building of Sydney's postmodern movement, and its significance from its role as a museum, all of which were under threat from this new plan. A later, separate, independent report by Lovell Chen for City of Sydney later had very similar findings, also noting that the museum was significant in all of these areas. But when this listing went ahead, it was made useless by multiple exemptions, in particular, giving them the ability to make any changes that they claim as crucial for the operation of the museum, and not considering anything later than 1980 as heritage. In 1980, the future museum site was still a dilapidated ruin. This went against everything said in the documentation for the listing, everything describing the significance of this building. The whole listing process was a waste of time and taxpayer money by all involved. This listing was unveiled months after technically getting signed off on. The government announced this listing to the public as a puff piece, a piece of spin to make it look like the government was protecting the museum when they very much weren't. Since the time it was supposedly saved, it seems that neither the state nor local government had found the time or really bothered examining the plans for the Powerhouse Museum, or read their own heritage reports. In meetings discussing a local heritage listing of the museum, City of Sydney showed little familiarity with any of the details of the plan, or the extreme demolition proposed. Clover Moore even stated at one point,
"I think things have reached a point now where the heritage is going to be respected and restored, and we are going to get a better outcome in terms of interiors and in terms of exhibition space."
This was after no shortage of messages in protest made by people who had been following the situation right from the start, yet all these were largely ignored.
However, more recently, the City of Sydney did come out with objections to the latest version of the plan, but it is likely too little too late. Investigative works and some minor demolition has already begun on the Powerhouse site.
And that brings us to today. The collection has been exiled into storage, some in Harwood, some at Castle Hill. Promises were made that the Catalina, Locomotive 1, and the Bolton and Watt, only 3 iconics out of so many more, were to be put back. But after so many broken promises, how can we believe them? These items are but a few of what the original Powerhouse had to offer. And what of all the items which were associated with them? A museum isn't just a building. The permanent exhibits are one of the things that keeps people coming back, but an item in isolation is far less exciting. Similar promises were made to restore Willow Grove, the heritage house which occupied the site of Powerhouse Parramatta. This was a storied maternity hospital and could have been used as part of a museum more locally themed to Parramatta, instead of the large generic venue which will now take its place. It's ironic, given how much built heritage played a role in shaping the original Powerhouse Museum, yet in this project, local heritage was simply swept away. Even though the government promised to rebuild it elsewhere, experts at the time said this would be impossible. This has since been proven true, and what's left of Willow Grove remains in storage. How long before they announced that restoring old favourite displays at Ultimo is also impossible? Before they reveal that it will cost too much, or reveal that items were damaged in the move? They certainly haven't designed spaces in the plan for these items, unlike the original, where displays and building went hand in hand.
Powerhouse today shows more interest in leaving room for fashion shows and music events than in the museum's original goals, and the new plan with its large empty volumes reflects this. What the government pitched this as was heritage restoration, something like what the original Powerhouse project did. But when we compare the two plans, the current and the original, they couldn't be more different. On one hand, we saw a vision of sharing the wonders of science and technology and the art in everyday items, a museum which tied theme and place together in a vision that could still be called innovative today. And along the way, a historic building would have much of its original character reinstated. And on the other hand, we have a big generic display space, a place they can rent out to corporations and use to host expensive parties, Far from restoring the museum, the only thing they're treating as historic is the remnant walls and frame of the old power plant. This new powerhouse will have most of the story, references, and history and character all stripped out. The only new theme replacing them, a very generic Sydney geology reference in the external brickwork. Despite all this, Powerhouse still has many volunteers, curators, and front-of-house staff with a great love of science, history, and technology. Perhaps one day, the Powerhouse will once again go back into the hands of executives and a director who share that same goal. But by then, the facility will have been reshaped in a very different direction, and hundreds of millions of dollars wasted in the process. The Powerhouse Museum we knew closed down on February 4, 2024. Those who flocked to the museum in its final days had the right idea. One last look at something we won't be seeing again. Perhaps it isn't too late. Perhaps a last-minute show of support or political intervention will change its fate. But short of such a last-minute miracle, the museum Sydney wanted to save is lost. Thank you for watching or listening. More information can be found at the Powerhouse Museum Alliance website, or the Save the Powerhouse Group Facebook group, or at any of the links shown in the description below.